In 1872, an elite British expedition marched into the Himalayas. They were not climbing. They were searching, and what they found was searching back. When the glacier began melting last summer, no one expected history to surface with it. At 19,000 feet above sea level, inside what climbers call the death zone, a satellite anomaly revealed something unnatural. Not rock, not ice, geometry, straight lines, a collapsed camp, preserved, frozen in time. When the recovery team reached it, the wind was screaming at 70 kilometers per hour, oxygen levels were thin, thoughts slowed, fingers numbed, and then they saw them. Boots, rusted instruments, a Union Jack patch stiff as stone. The lost British Himalayan survey of 1872. Official records say they vanished in a storm, but storms don't leave bite marks. Inside a half-buried leather trunk were journals, leather hardened by frost, ink faded but legible. The first few entries were ordinary. Altitude stable. Mapping glacial shifts. Local guides refused to go further north. Then came the deviation. They abandoned known trade routes, ignored Sherpa warnings, pushed toward peaks that were not on any map. One journal entry stopped the recovery team cold. Something is beneath the ice. We hear it at night. At first they assumed avalanche echoes, but the entries grew stranger. Footprints, not ours, elongated. No boots, skin pale as frost. Then the tone changed, from curiosity to fear. The expedition was led by Captain Edward Harrow, Royal Geographical Society, a disciplined man, rational, not prone to hysteria. His handwriting deteriorates over days. Ink scratches harder. Sentences shorten. Private Collins missing. No signs of struggle. Snow disturbed. Drag marks. Drag marks. That word appears 7 times in the final 10 pages. Dragged, not buried, not lost. Dragged. Here's where the story shifts, because forensic teams didn't just find journals. They found bones, still partially encased in ice. Tibia fractured, rib cages cracked inward. And the bite marks. Not wolf, not snow leopard, not bear. The spacing between punctures was too narrow. Too uniform, human-like, but wrong, sharper, more numerous, like something with too many teeth. One page, dated November 17, 1872, reads, "They watch from crevices, skin like glass, eyes reflect nothing, glass skin. Let that sink in." Creatures described as elongated, thin, almost translucent, living under the ice, waiting. The camp layout reveals something terrifying. The sentries were placed outward, facing the mountains, but every body was found facing inward. They weren't attacked from outside. They were pulled from below. The snow beneath their tents had collapsed, like something tunneled upward. One survivor's final entry ends mid-sentence. "They have begun taking us during the dark hours when the wind howls loud." Enough to hide the sound of, it stops there. The page is torn. There are 3 parallel gouge marks across it. Not ink. Pressure tears. Official Victorian records blamed exposure. But exposure does not remove flesh clean from bone. Exposure does not leave organized feeding patterns. Exposure does not drag a 200-pound soldier silently across snow without a scream, unless the scream was swallowed. Local Himalayan folklore speaks of beings called the Pale Beneath, mountain spirits, ice dwellers, predators that surface only when the glaciers shift. Sherpa oral history warned, "Do not sleep where the mountain breathes." The British laughed at superstition. They stopped laughing by day 12. Modern ground-penetrating radar now shows something else. Beneath the rediscovered campsite, a hollow network. Caverns. Warm pockets beneath frozen crust. Something lives down there. Or lived. And the glacier protected the secret for 150 years. Until now, the final recovered artifact was a compass. Bent inward, as if crushed by hand. Or something stronger. And scratched into its brass surface were 2 words. They rise. But rise from where? And more importantly, why did the journals describe coordinated hunting patterns? Because this wasn't random feeding. This was strategy. They isolated sentries. They attacked during storms. They dragged prey into thermal tunnels. And they left just enough evidence to be dismissed as madness until the ice melted. We now have preserved bones with non-human trauma, journals describing subterranean predators, satellite scans showing thermal anomalies, and a region where even today climbers disappear without trace. This was not a storm. This was not starvation. This was predation. And the worst part? The expedition may not have been the first or the last, because the glacier is melting faster now than ever recorded, and if something was sealed beneath it, it is no longer sealed. Something ancient survived the Ice Age. Something adapted. Something waited. And in 1872, it hunted. But what exactly were the pale ones? How could biology produce translucent, cold-adapted humanoids? And why does the bone trauma suggest intelligence? That's where the science becomes disturbing, because myth is about to collide with anatomy. What if the journals weren't fear-induced hallucinations? What if Captain Harrow wasn't losing his mind, but documenting a species? Because when modern forensic teams re-examined the bones, they didn't find superstition. They found biology. The sketches inside the leather-bound journals are disturbingly detailed. Not rough panic drawings, not abstract shapes. Anatomical, precise. Captain Harrow had training in scientific illustration. His sketches show elongated limbs, hyperextended joints, and fingers slightly longer than a human hand should allow. But the most unsettling detail? The skin. He shaded it lightly, almost translucent. And beside one sketch he wrote, "Veins visible, no pigmentation." Now here's where it gets terrifying. Modern cave dwelling. Organisms on Earth, from blind salamanders to deep-sea fish, and often lose pigmentation over generations. Melanin becomes unnecessary in darkness. The body conserves energy. The skin pales. This is not mythology. It's evolutionary adaptation. But those are small creatures, insects, amphibians, not humanoids. Let's analyze the physiology described. The pale ones were said to have translucent skin, oversized pupils, narrow torsos, elongated mandibles, silent movement. Oversized pupils suggest extreme light sensitivity, meaning they evolved in total darkness, likely underground. Narrow torsos? Less body mass means less caloric demand, essential in nutrient-scarce environments. But the mandibles, that's where the forensic evidence aligns, because the bite marks on the 1872 skeletons weren't flat like human teeth. They were conical, layered, as if multiple rows curved inward, similar to predatory fish, except terrestrial. Modern forensic odontologists measured the spacing between punctures, too narrow for wolves, too uniform for bears, too many for humans, and angled downward, indicating a jaw structure slightly protruding. One journal entry reads, "They bite and pull backward. Flesh tears clean. Backward. That implies leverage, predatory feeding behavior. Calculated, efficient. This wasn't scavenging. It was targeted muscle extraction. Protein first, organs second. Minimal waste. Apex predator strategy. But how could something like this survive in the Himalayas? The answer might lie beneath the ice. Recent thermal scans of high-altitude regions reveal subglacial geothermal vents, heat pockets, underground rivers, massive limestone cavern systems, warm enough to sustain life, dark enough to force evolutionary adaptation, isolated enough to prevent discovery. In 2023, satellite imaging detected anomalous heat signatures beneath the exact coordinates of the 1872 campsite. Not volcanic, not tectonic, localized, stable, almost like habitation zones. Captain Harrow wrote something chilling. They retreat when dawn approaches. They do not favor light. That aligns with cave-adapted species. Light damages their eyes, their skin. They surface only during storms, when the sky is dark and winds mask sound. And here's the strategic brilliance. Storms reduce visibility, reduce scent trails, reduce human alertness. They hunted during environmental chaos. Not randomly, intelligently. Now consider this. Sherpa folklore describes beings that breathe with the mountain, meaning they emerge when glaciers shift, when snow cracks, when thermal vents open pathways. Global warming accelerates that process. Ice recedes, tunnels expose, predators adapt. In 1872, a minor glacial thaw may have opened temporary access points. The British expedition unknowingly camped above a feeding corridor. They didn't invade territory. They built on top of it. One particularly disturbing journal entry details an encounter. Observed one at 20 paces, height near 7 feet, limbs bent wrong, eyes reflect faint blue. Blue reflection suggests a tapetum lucidum, a reflective layer found in nocturnal. Predators like cats and wolves, it enhances night vision, but humans don't have it. If the pale ones did, they were optimized for darkness. And if optimized, they evolved that way, for generations, possibly centuries. Then comes the question nobody wants to ask. If they evolved underground, where did they originate? Some evolutionary biologists theorize isolated human, offshoot populations could adapt drastically over thousands of years. Extreme environments accelerate mutation selection. What if a prehistoric human group became trapped in Himalayan cave systems during the last ice age? Over 20,000 years, natural selection could reshape anatomy. Pigmentation lost, eyes enlarged, diet altered, jaw structure modified. Human, but no longer us. And then there's the intelligence factor. Because coordinated drag and drop hunting requires planning, the predators targeted outer sentries first, reduced perimeter defense, waited for storms, attacked in silence. That's not instinct alone. That's strategy. That's learning behavior. One entry reads, "They test our reactions. Throw stones, watch." They were studying the expedition, studying fear, studying weakness. Here's the most chilling part. None of the skeletons showed defensive wounds on forearms. No fractures consistent with prolonged struggle. Which means the attacks were fast, overwhelming, likely from below. Imagine lying in a tent, storm raging outside, then the ground beneath you collapses. Cold hands grip your ankles. You're pulled into darkness before you can scream. Your tent collapses above you. The wind erases evidence, and your comrades think you wandered into the blizzard until the drag marks appear. Captain Harrow's final coherent paragraph reads, "They are not beasts. They are organized. We are intruders." That sentence changes everything, because if the Pale Ones possess hierarchy, communication, territory defense, then this wasn't feeding. It was retaliation. The British deviated from mapped routes, entered uncharted peaks, disturbed thermal caverns. They didn't discover something. They trespassed. Modern geneticists have requested access to bone fragments showing saliva residue. If preserved DNA exists, it could confirm non-human markers. But funding was quietly withdrawn. Official reasoning, insufficient evidence. Unofficial whispers suggest something else. Because if a subterranean humanoid species exists, it rewrites anthropology, it rewrites history, and it raises one terrifying possibility. They are still there, adapting, waiting. Because glaciers are melting faster than they did in 1872, thermal tunnels are expanding, and climbers still disappear. No avalanches, no bodies, just equipment left behind. Like the expedition, like history repeating. So the question isn't whether the Pale Ones existed. The question is, how many generations have they survived beneath the Himalayas? And what happens when their hunting grounds fully thaw? Because Part 3 reveals something worse than bite marks. It reveals the pattern of a massacre. And patterns mean planning. Part 3, the anatomy of a massacre. Mini-hook, predators leave chaos. This did not. The 1872 camp wasn't torn apart. It was dismantled, systematically. And once investigators mapped the layout, the horror became mathematical. When the glacier finally exposed the full perimeter of the British camp, researchers expected disorder, scattered supplies, overturned crates, signs of panic. Instead, they found structure. Tents arranged in a disciplined semicircle, cookfire pit intact, medical trunk unopened, no signs of widespread struggle. But something was wrong. Every outer sentry position was empty. The bones were found closer to the center, as if the perimeter collapsed inward. Not from external attack, from below. Using 3D reconstruction, forensic teams recreated the original camp coordinates. Then they marked drag lines preserved in compressed ice layers. There were 12 clear paths, all leading toward the same direction. North-northeast, toward a limestone ridge, directly above the thermal anomaly detected by satellite imaging. Not random, converging, like prey trails. Here's where it becomes disturbing. The drag marks were not straight. They zigzagged, meaning the bodies weren't simply pulled. They were adjusted, corrected for balance, steered, which implies more than one attacker per victim, coordination, and strength. Because some of these men weighed over 180 pounds with gear, pulling that weight across snow and thin air requires power. But none of the snow showed deep claw marks, no animal tracks, only smooth displacement, as if something moved low to the ground, or beneath it. Let's talk about the bite trauma. Recovered femurs show spiral fractures. That happens when a bone is twisted before breaking, like pulling a limb backward during feeding. Rib cages were collapsed inward, not crushed randomly, but punctured between ribs, precise, avoiding thick bone, targeting soft tissue. That's anatomical knowledge, instinct refined over generations, and the puncture depth, 4 centimeters. Uniform, too consistent to be accidental. The Pale Ones weren't tearing blindly. They were harvesting. One skeleton was found missing only the calves, nothing else removed. That suggests selective feeding, high muscle density, quick extraction, energy efficient. Predators conserve calories. They don't waste movement, especially in extreme cold. Now imagine the sequence. Storm builds, wind howls, visibility drops. Outer sentry hears movement but sees nothing. Snow beneath his boots cracks. He falls waist deep into darkness. Anne sees him. He tries to scream. Wind swallows it. Within seconds, he's below the surface. The snow shifts back. The next sentry notices nothing, until he too vanishes. One by one, perimeter erased. Then the interior collapses. Captain Harrow's final entries confirm this pattern. They wait for isolation. They do not attack the group. They reduce us. Reduce us. Military strategy. Divide and eliminate. The camp never launched a full defense because it never faced a full assault. Just disappearances. Confusion. Sleep deprivation. Fear. Psychological erosion. By the time they realized the threat wasn't weather, they were too few. But here's the most chilling discovery. Underneath Tent 3, researchers found claw scoring on limestone. Parallel grooves, 3 inches apart. 8 marks in total. Repeated motion. Upward direction. That suggests something climbing vertically from below. Climbing into the tent floor, the pale ones weren't breaking through randomly. They had entry points, tunnels, pre-existing passageways mapped beneath the camp. The British unknowingly pitched their tents on a ventilation shaft, a hunting hatch. Now consider this. Why weren't all bodies removed? Why leave remains? Because predators often store food, cache it, especially in cold climates. Some bones were partially buried within ice cavities near the ridge, as if temporarily hidden, but never fully consumed. Why? The journals may provide the answer. One entry states, "They seem agitated tonight. More numerous. Vocalizations echo beneath us. More numerous," which implies colony behavior. If multiple individuals fed at once, competition increases. Food storage becomes necessary, but then something changed. Because the final 3 bodies were not dragged. They were left in the open, torso cavities emptied, spines severed, and their skulls cracked open, not crushed, opened, as if something inside was extracted. Brain tissue, high fat content, nutrient rich. In extreme cold, fat equals survival. The pale ones weren't just feeding, they were optimizing. Now here's the question that terrifies researchers. Why did the feeding pattern escalate? Because the first few disappearances were clean, silent, minimal remains. But the last 3 show frenzy. Speed. Violence. Which suggests urgency. Perhaps the British discovered something. Perhaps they attempted to enter the tunnel system, or seal it, or light it. Captain Harrow's final legible sentence reads, "We found their chamber." Then ink trails off. No explanation, no description, just that. Their chamber, meaning the expedition retaliated, meaning they descended, and what they saw triggered the final assault. Modern thermal imaging beneath the ridge reveals a hollow cavity approximately 40 meters wide, large enough to house dozens of individuals, or nests, or worse. And if the pale ones have reproductive cycles tied to seasonal thaw, then November 1872 may have coincided with a vulnerable period. Perhaps the expedition stumbled upon offspring, eggs, juveniles. If so, the massacre wasn't hunger. It was defense. The pattern is clear now. Isolation, subsurface access, targeted removal, nutrient extraction, colony behavior, strategic escalation. This was not a beast attacking travelers. This was an organized species defending territory. And the British walked straight into it. But what lies inside a chamber beneath 19,000 feet of ice? What forced Captain Harrow's handwriting to devolve into jagged scratches? And why do modern satellite scans show that the thermal signature beneath that ridge has grown stronger over the past decade? Because Part 4 reveals something even older than 1872, something that predates the expedition by centuries, and suggests the pale ones were never alone beneath the Himalayas. Part 4, Subterranean Origins. Mini hook. Captain Harrow wrote 3 words before the ink tore through the page. We descended below. They didn't just discover predators, they entered their world, and what they found down there was older than the expedition, older than the empire, maybe older than recorded history itself. The final recovered journal wasn't complete. Pages were water damaged, edges shredded. But fragments remain, and when pieced together, a sequence emerges. On November 21st, 1872, after 6 men had vanished, Captain Harrow ordered a search of the limestone ridge. They found a fissure, not wide, but warm air rising through frozen rock. That should not exist at 19,000 feet. Warmth means energy. Energy means ecosystem. 2 men volunteered to descend. Rope secured. Lantern lit. They expected ice. They found stone, dry stone, with scratch marks. Vertical. Layered. Ancient. The rope went slack. Minutes passed. Then one of the men shouted upward, "Sir, there are bones. Not British bones, old bones, animal. Yuck. Ibex. Some human. But weathered differently. Polished. Gnawed. Stacked. Predators don't stack bones, unless they organize space. Unless this wasn't random feeding. Unless this was habitation." Harrow descended next. His handwriting changes dramatically here. Short phrases. Heavy ink pressure. Almost frantic. Cavern extends beyond lantern reach. walls smooth from passage. Heat increases inward. Heat increasing deeper underground confirms geothermal venting, and where there is stable heat, there can be stable life, isolated, hidden, protected from ice age extinctions, protected from human discovery, until 1872. Then comes the line that unsettled modern anthropologists. Carvings in stone, not natural. Carvings.
That means symbolism.
Symbolism means cognition. The sketches beside this note show spiral shapes, interlocking lines, and humanoid silhouettes, but elongated. The pale ones were not animals nesting in a cave. They had territory, possibly culture, possibly memory. Local Himalayan oral history speaks of beings called the Nangpo-ji, translated loosely, those who remain below. Stories passed through generations in remote villages near Himalayas describe pale guardians beneath sacred peaks. They do not ascend often, only when disturbed, only when hungry, only when the mountain opens its breath. The British dismissed it as folklore, but folklore often encodes survival warnings. Modern satellite surveys conducted near the rediscovery site show a network of limestone caverns stretching kilometers beneath the ridge. Thermal signatures pulse seasonally, stronger during thaw, weaker in deep winter, which suggests metabolic activity, something that responds to temperature, not random geothermal fluctuation. Living systems adjust to environment. Rock does not. Now here's the evolutionary theory no one wants to publish. Roughly 25,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, human populations migrated unpredictably due to extreme climate shifts. Some groups vanished from the fossil record entirely. No burial sites, no settlements, no tools. What if some didn't vanish? What if they went underground, trapped by advancing glaciers, forced into cave networks, surviving on small mammals, gradually adapting, generation after generation in darkness, skin losing pigment, eyes enlarging, diet shifting toward high-fat prey, jaws strengthening, a new branch of hominin evolution, not extinct, just isolated. We already know multiple human species coexisted. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Denisovan DNA has been traced to Himalayan regions. Fragments discovered in caves near Tibet show unknown genetic markers, unclassified, unresolved. What if the pale ones are not monsters, but a divergent human offshoot? That possibility terrifies institutions, because it means humanity did not conquer the mountains. We share them. Captain Harrow's final descent lasted under 20 minutes. He wrote, "They see in dark as we see in day." Then, movement along ceiling. Ceiling, meaning they climb overhead, meaning their skeletal structure allows inversion, extended shoulder mobility, flexible joints, optimized for vertical limestone shafts, ambush from above. Now picture the camp again, tents built directly over ventilation cracks. They weren't just pulled downward. They were attacked from beneath and above, a three-dimensional hunting ground. The final intact page contains smeared ink, as if written while running. They do not fear fire. That contradicts animal instinct. Most predators retreat from flame, but cave-dwelling organisms, exposed to geothermal light, may not associate fire with danger, meaning torches did not repel them, meaning the British had no advantage underground. Now here's the shift. Because modern explorers attempted a controlled descent near the rediscovered ridge 2 years ago, they never reached the cavern. A minor tremor sealed the fissure, officially recorded as natural instability. Unofficially, seismic data shows a pressure shift from below, like something collapsed inward intentionally, as if tunnels were reinforced or sealed. Intelligence adapts, and if the pale ones survived 150 years, they may have learned. And here's what makes this present day relevant. Global warming is accelerating glacial retreat across the Himalayas. Ice that sealed entrances for centuries is thinning. Thermal corridors expanding. If subterranean systems are opening seasonally, surface encounters will increase. And there have been reports, unexplained disappearances, climbers vanishing without avalanche evidence, equipment found near limestone ridges, no bodies, just drag patterns partially covered by snow, exactly like 1872. One final note from Harrow's journal. They are not beasts of impulse. They wait. Waiting implies patience. Long-term survival. Time means nothing to something that measures generations in darkness. And the mountain offers everything they need. Heat, shelter, prey, isolation. But here's the part that shifts from history to warning, because the 1872 expedition may have triggered something. They entered the chamber. They saw carvings. They disturbed habitat. The massacre escalated, and if the pale ones defend territory, what happens when modern drilling, tourism, and climate change increase intrusion? What happens when entire tunnel networks thaw? Because Part 5 reveals something chilling. Recent disappearances match the exact Pattern documented in 1872. Same altitude range. Same ridge formations. Same storm timing. History isn't repeating. It never stopped. Part 5. The modern threat of the high peaks. Mini-hook. What if 1872 was not an isolated tragedy, but a preview? Because in the last 20 years, something has been happening in the high ranges of the Himalayas. Something quiet. Something familiar. And when investigators compared the patterns, they froze. In 1998, a two-man alpine team attempting a new route near an uncharted limestone ridge vanished overnight. No avalanche, no storm damage, no blood, just a collapsed tent floor and drag impressions in the snow that led north-northeast. The same direction documented in 1872. In 2006, 3 climbers disappeared during a sudden windstorm. Their camp was later found intact. Food untouched. Boots lined up outside the tent. Inside, the snow beneath one sleeping bag had compacted downward, like weight had been forced through it. Again, no body. Then in 2019, satellite thermal imaging revealed fluctuating heat pockets beneath a ridge that had recently lost nearly 18% of its glacial cover in just a decade. 18%. That's not slow melting. That's exposure. Exposure of tunnels that may not have seen daylight in centuries. And when researchers overlaid the coordinates of missing climbers since 1975, a pattern emerged. Clusters, within a 12-kilometer radius, centered above subterranean limestone networks. Exactly like the 1872 site. Here's what makes this more disturbing. Most high-altitude disappearances involve avalanches, crevasse falls, or altitude sickness. But these cases lacked environmental trauma. No fractured bones from impact. No buried gear. No torn tents. Instead, there were subtle depressions in snow layers, almost like the ground briefly opened, then sealed again. A Sherpa guide who requested anonymity described something strange during a 2017 expedition. He reported hearing breathing beneath the ice during a windstorm. Not wind echo. Rhythmic. Layered. He refused to camp near the ridge after sunset. When asked why, he said, "The mountain was awake." Modern glaciologists confirm that glacial thinning increases the likelihood of subsurface collapse points, meaning if cavern systems exist beneath limestone ridges, they are becoming more accessible. And if something inhabits those systems, surface encounters become statistically inevitable. Now consider the timeline. 1872, confirmed massacre. Late 1900s, isolated disappearances. 2000s onward, clustered vanishings near thermal anomalies. Frequency increasing. Not dramatically, but measurably, which suggests one of two possibilities. Either human activity is encroaching on their territory, or their territory is expanding upward. There's another chilling similarity. In both 1872 and modern cases, attacks coincide with storms. High winds above 60 km/h, low visibility, night hours, exactly when sound masking is strongest, exactly when prey is most disoriented. Predatory timing hasn't changed in 150 years. That means instinct persists, or memory does. Satellite data from 2021 revealed something else. A series of minor seismic tremors concentrated beneath the same ridge system. Not tectonic shifts. Localized. Shallow. Almost like structural reinforcement activity underground. Now that could be geological settling. Or it could be something moving. In numbers. A joint geological survey attempted to deploy a ground-penetrating radar system near one hotspot in 2022. The device malfunctioned repeatedly. Interference spikes. Signal distortion. When recalibrated away from the ridge, it worked perfectly. Electromagnetic disruption is rare at that altitude unless mineral density is unusually high, or cavities are irregular, or something inside those cavities reflects signal unpredictably. And here's the question nobody publicly asks. If the pale ones are real, are they aware of us? In 1872, Captain Harrow wrote, "They test us." Modern climbers report small stones thrown near camps during storms, not avalanches, pebbles. Deliberate, thrown from darkness. Testing reaction. Testing alertness. That pattern has been reported in at least 4 separate expeditions over the past 30 years. Coincidence or reconnaissance behavior? Now think evolutionarily. If a subterranean species survived thousands of years, they would adapt to environmental shifts. Glacial retreat means increased light exposure, increased human presence. They would either retreat deeper or modify behavior. More stealth, more nighttime emergence, more rapid strike and retreat patterns. Exactly what recent cases suggest. Global warming is not just melting ice. It is destabilizing sealed ecosystems. Ecosystems we never cataloged, never studied, never prepared for. The Himalayas contain over 15,000 glaciers, thousands of limestone cavern networks, most unmapped, most unreachable. Until recently, If even one major tunnel system becomes exposed during a seasonal thaw, surface hunting corridors expand, and if colony behavior exists, population density might not be small. We assume rarity because we see few encounters. But underground ecosystems can sustain far more life than surface. Visibility suggests, especially if prey migrates seasonally. Yuck. Goat. Human. Protein is protein. The 1872 expedition may have survived long enough to document them. Modern climbers may not be so fortunate, because today's expeditions are smaller, lighter, less armed, more reliant on minimal gear, which means vulnerability increases, and storms are more frequent now due to climate instability. More storms, more masking noise, more opportunity. There is one final modern detail. In 2020, a partially exposed bone fragment was recovered near a melting ridge, not from 1872. Carbon dating suggests early 1900s. The puncture marks, 4 centimeters deep, uniform, conical, matching the 1872 trauma pattern exactly. That means the pale ones did not vanish after the British expedition. They continued, quietly, undetected, until the ice began to thin again. So here we are. Glaciers receding faster than ever recorded, thermal caverns warming, storm frequency rising, disappearances clustering, history aligning with present. The mountain is opening its breath again, and something beneath it may be preparing. Because Part 6 reveals something darker than survival, evidence suggesting the pale ones are not merely reacting, but anticipating. They are anticipating. Mini-hook. Predators react, but apex predators prepare. And what researchers uncovered in the thermal data from the Himalayas suggests something deeply unsettling. The pale ones may not just be surviving, they may be adapting ahead of us. When glacial melt patterns from 2000 to 2024 were overlaid with satellite heat signatures, a strange sequence appeared. The thermal pockets didn't expand randomly. They shifted gradually upward, higher altitude, closer to seasonal climbing routes. That's not simple geothermal drift. That's directional migration. If confirmed, it would mean subterranean systems are being reoccupied strategically, closer to food sources, closer to human activity. A 2022 Alpine research drone flew over one anomaly during late autumn. Its thermal camera briefly captured something moving along a limestone fissure. Tall, thin, fast, too quick for full identification. The footage lasted 3.7 seconds before interference cut the signal. Officials labeled it sensor distortion, but frame analysis showed articulated limb motion, not wind, not shadow, jointed movement. Vertical posture, then gone. Let's return to 1872. Captain Harrow wrote, "They watch before they take." That implies reconnaissance, studying prey behavior before attack. Now compare that to recent expedition reports. Climbers describe hearing movement around camp hours before disappearances occur. Light crunches on snow, then silence, almost like perimeter mapping, almost like learning patterns. If a species has survived thousands of years in isolation, its greatest advantage isn't strength, it's patience. Here's something rarely discussed publicly. In 2015, a glacial biologist discovered a set of unusual depressions along a melting ridge corridor. They were not footprints, more like elongated pressure impressions, approximately 28 centimeters long, too narrow for human boots, too consistent for natural collapse. Spacing suggested bipedal gait. Stride length roughly 1.4 meters. That indicates height near 7 feet, exactly matching Harrow's description. The data was archived, not published. Reason cited, insufficient contextual evidence. But the most chilling evidence comes from seismic readings. Microtremors beneath the ridge have become more frequent during transitional seasons. Spring, autumn, not winter, not peak summer. Transitional seasons align with temperature shifts, which means movement correlates with environmental change. Adaptive timing, not random wandering. Now consider intelligence evolution. A subterranean species would rely heavily on sound and vibration to navigate. Over generations, sensitivity to surface movement could increase dramatically. They would sense footsteps through limestone, heartbeats through ground pressure. They wouldn't need sight to detect intruders. And if they learned that human camps produce predictable vibrations at night, sleeping, minimal movement, storm masking, that becomes optimal strike timing. Exactly what 1872 documents. Exactly what modern patterns show. But here's the deeper concern. What if the pale ones are not merely defensive? What if they are reclaiming lost territory? Glacial retreat exposes ancient corridors once sealed by ice. Territory expansion opportunities, more surface access, wider hunting range. In ecological terms, that's population growth behavior. Species expand when habitat opens. especially apex predators. One independent researcher compared heat map density from 2003 to 23. The number of active thermal nodes increased by 31%. 31% in 2 decades. That's not subtle. That's growth. Either tunnels are opening faster, or something inside is occupying more space. And then there's the silence factor. No recorded surface attacks during daylight. No sightings under clear skies. Only storms. Only low visibility. That suggests strategic concealment awareness. They understand when they can be seen. They choose not to be. That is not primitive instinct. That is calculated restraint. In one declassified environmental report, a remote acoustic sensor placed near a melting ridge recorded low-frequency vocalizations during a windstorm. Not wind resonance. Structured patterns. Rhythmic pulses. Like communication. 3 repeating tones. Followed by silence, then movement spikes. Minutes later, surface vibration detected, then nothing, coinciding with a nearby climber disappearance 2 days later. Correlation is not proof, but patterns are hard to ignore. If the pale ones communicate acoustically underground, they could coordinate hunts over distance, alert colony members, signal intrusion, organize defense. 1872 may not have been a small isolated group. It may have been a colony reacting collectively, which raises a terrifying possibility. If a colony exists, how large is it? Dozens? Hundreds? Generations living unseen beneath one of Earth's most remote mountain ranges. Here's the part that shifts this from mystery to warning. Global climate projections show Himalayan glacial mass could decline up to 40% by mid-century. 40%. That's not gradual thinning. That's structural transformation. Entire tunnel systems could become semi-accessible, ventilation shafts widening, entry points multiplying. And if a species has been confined for millennia, expanded habitat means expanded opportunity. The pale ones may not view us as invaders. They may view us as seasonal prey, predictable. Climbing seasons follow consistent months. Storm cycles are measurable. Camp placement often repeats historical routes. From their perspective, humans behave predictably, and predictability invites exploitation. Captain Harrow's final torn line may hold the key. They are learning. At first glance, it sounds like panic, but now, 150 years later, it sounds like observation. Because if they observed fire and did not fear it, if they adapted to surface noise, if they shifted habitat upward as ice retreated, that is learning behavior. Not myth, not superstition, adaptation. And adaptation is what keeps species alive. For thousands of years, in darkness, in silence, waiting for the mountain to breathe again. But here's what makes Part 7 even darker. Because newly analyzed bone fragments suggest something unexpected, something that implies the pale ones may not be as separate from us as we think. The DNA question has finally surfaced, and the preliminary findings are disturbing. What if the pale ones aren't monsters? What if they're relatives? Because when scientists finally extracted microscopic residue from the 1872 bone fragments, they didn't find animal DNA. They found something far more disturbing, something almost human. For decades, funding to analyze the 1872 skeletal remains was quietly denied. Official reasoning, contamination risk. Unofficial reasoning, reputational risk. Because if the bite marks belong to a non-animal predator, the implications would destabilize anthropology itself. But in 2023, a small independent lab was granted limited access to preserved femur fragments recovered from the ridge beneath the Himalayas. The fragments still contained trace organic residue within the puncture channels. Microscopic, but intact. Saliva proteins fossilize under extreme cold surprisingly well. And when they sequenced what little genetic material remained, they didn't get a wolf. They didn't get a bear. They didn't get a known carnivore. They got a partial hominin match. Not modern human, not fully, but not entirely separate either. The sequence showed overlap with archaic human markers, specifically those linked to Denisovan ancestry. Denisovans are an extinct hominin species, whose genetic traces remain in certain Himalayan and Tibetan populations today. They adapted to high altitude, to low oxygen, to cold. But the fragment didn't match known Denisovan samples exactly. It diverged significantly, which means one of two things. Either contamination occurred, or the pale ones represent an unclassified branch of human evolution. Let that sink in. Not creatures from folklore, not demons, not supernatural beings. A branch of humanity that adapted so drastically to subterranean Himalayan life. They became unrecognizable over thousands of years. The lab refused to publish definitive conclusions. Their statement read, "Results inconclusive due to degradation." But internal notes leaked to a research forum described the match as structurally hominin with extreme mutation density and pigmentation in ocular development genes. Pigmentation loss, enlarged pupils, exactly as Captain Harrow described in 1872, exactly as modern thermal silhouettes suggest. Now the evolutionary theory gains weight. Imagine a small ice age, population trapped by advancing glaciers 20,000 years ago. Cut off, forced underground. Generations pass. Natural selection favors those who tolerate darkness, those with stronger jaw musculature, those with heightened vibration sensitivity, those who conserve energy efficiently. Within a few thousand years, they look different. Within 10,000, they are different, still human enough genetically to overlap, but no longer part of surface civilization. Here's what makes this terrifying. If they are hominin, they are intelligent, language capable, socially structured, memory-bearing. That means the carvings Captain Harrow saw were not instinctual markings. They were symbolic, meaningful, perhaps even historical records. Maybe they remember 1872. Maybe they tell that story underground, not as a massacre, but as an invasion. And here's the darker layer. The genetic fragment revealed accelerated mutations in genes associated with night vision and metabolic efficiency. That suggests long-term adaptation to nutrient scarcity and darkness. But it also showed elevated markers in aggression response genes, stress adaptation, predatory behavior enhancement. If confirmed, that means the pale ones are biologically optimized hunters, not emotionally driven killers, purpose-built survivors. There is one more piece of the puzzle. Modern Himalayan populations carry Denisovan DNA at higher rates than almost anywhere else on Earth, meaning ancient interbreeding occurred at some point in deep history. If a subterranean hominin branch persisted, there's a remote but chilling possibility. Contact may not have been one-sided. Surface humans may have encountered them before, interacted, even exchanged genes, which means the line between us and them is thinner than we want to believe. Captain Harrow wrote something that seemed like fear at the time. They resemble us in shape, but not in presence. Presence, that word matters. He didn't say they were beasts. He didn't say they were demons. He implied familiarity, distorted familiarity, the kind that triggers instinctive unease, because humans recognize human shapes. And when those shapes move wrong, when joints bend too fluidly, when eyes reflect light unnaturally, it unsettles something ancient in us. The final DNA report concluded with a warning note. Sample too degraded for classification. Further excavation required. Further excavation into active thermal tunnels, into potentially inhabited caverns. No official expedition has been approved, for obvious reasons, because if the pale ones exist, they are not fossils. They are a living species, protected by altitude, ice, and isolation, and they have survived without surface contact for millennia. But climate change doesn't negotiate. Glacial retreat continues. Tunnel systems expand. Habitat boundaries blur. If a subterranean population has been stable for thousands of years, rapid environmental shift could destabilize them, drive them outward, toward food, toward surface corridors, toward us. And that brings us to the question no government agency wants to answer publicly. If the pale ones are a divergent human lineage, do they have territorial rights? Or are they classified as wildlife or threats? What happens if undeniable evidence surfaces? The ethical, legal, and biological implications are staggering, which may explain the silence, the archived data, the unpublished reports, the reluctance to descend again, because Part 8 is not about the past, it's about the future. What happens when the ice fully recedes, when thermal vents widen, when seasonal storms become more violent, when climbers increase in number, and when the pale ones no longer remain confined below? The mountain is changing, and something beneath. It may be preparing for a world it hasn't seen in 20,000 years. Part 8. When the mountain opens. Mini hook. The question was never did they exist. The real question is, what happens when they no longer need to hide? Because the ice is thinning, the tunnels are widening, and history has already shown us what occurs when the mountain breathes. 1872 was not discovery, it was contact. Glacial scientists now confirm that several ridge systems in the Himalayas have lost more ice in the last 25 years than in the previous century combined. That is not a slow thaw. That is exposure. Ancient surfaces are being revealed for the first time since the last ice age. And beneath those surfaces, thermal corridors, limestone caverns, air pockets expanding upward. If a subterranean species has survived in isolation, their prison walls are dissolving. But here is what makes this final chapter different. Because in late autumn of last year, seismic monitors detected sustained rhythmic vibrations beneath a ridge previously considered dormant. Not a tremor, not tectonic slip, patterned pulses. 3 intervals. Pause. 3 intervals again. Exactly matching the acoustic structure recorded years earlier. Communication, not collapse. And then came the disappearance, a solo alpine climber attempting a new line. During storm season vanished, 48 hours after posting coordinates from a limestone shoulder. No avalanche report, no fall evidence, no emergency beacon activation. When search teams reached the location, they found a partially sunken tent floor, snow compacted inward, drag impressions leading toward a recently exposed crevice, north-northeast. The same direction as 1872, the same direction as 1998, 2006, 20s and 19. Patterns don't lie. Now imagine this from their perspective. For 20,000 years, they lived beneath ice. The world above was frozen, unreachable, irrelevant. Then gradually the ceiling thins, light seeps deeper, surface vibrations increase. Strange beings walk overhead seasonally, predictable, soft, warm, and loud. They adapt, they observe, they test. Just as Captain Harrow wrote, they are learning. But what if the final shift is not territorial defense, but expansion? If habitat expands upward, population can increase. If food sources become more frequent, colony growth accelerates. And if intelligence exists, symbolic carvings, coordinated hunts, acoustic signaling, then long-term planning may exist too. We assume apex predators respond only to hunger, but intelligent predators respond to opportunity. And the Himalayas are opening opportunity at an unprecedented rate. There's another unsettling detail. Climate models predict intensified storm frequency at high altitudes over the next 3 decades. More masking noise, more surface instability, more hunting windows. Storms were their ally in 1872. In one archived fragment of Captain Harrow's journal, a line overlooked for decades, he wrote something almost philosophical. That sentence changes everything, because if the Pale Ones observe patterns, they don't see explorers. They see behavior cycles, arrival, camp placement, nightfall, storm, sleep, repeat. To a subterranean intelligence, humans are predictable seasonal phenomena, like migrating animals, like prey herds. But here's the deeper horror. If DNA analysis is correct, if they share archaic human ancestry and then the Pale Ones are not alien to this planet, they are a branch of it, a path evolution took that surface humanity never followed. We built cities. They built caverns. We adapted to light. They mastered darkness. We feared isolation. They survived it. And now, environmental change is collapsing the barrier between those two worlds. So what happens next? 3 possibilities exist. First, they retreat deeper, sealing tunnels as glaciers vanish. Second, they adapt to surface conditions gradually, increasing encounters. Third, and most concerning, they begin active territorial expansion upward as habitat stabilizes. If even one major colony reaches sustainable surface access, the myth of mountain spirits will become biological reality. But here's the truth few are willing to say aloud. There is no confirmed evidence that they are extinct. There is no confirmed evidence that the colony beneath that ridge was abandoned. Thermal anomalies persist. Seismic pulses continue. Disappearances cluster. The data does not suggest extinction. It suggests endurance. In 1872, an Empire-backed expedition entered uncharted peaks and vanished. Officially blamed on weather. Unofficially, predation. In 2026, climbers still vanish in similar conditions. Officially blamed on terrain. Unofficially, silence. Because acknowledging a surviving subterranean hominin species would rewrite anthropology, geopolitics, and ethics overnight. So the ice melts quietly. The reports archive quietly. The mountain breathes quietly. And something below waits. Maybe the Pale Ones don't see themselves as monsters. Maybe they see themselves as guardians of territory, reclaimed after millennia of confinement. Maybe 1872 was not an attack. Maybe it was a warning. Do not descend. Do not disturb. Do not build above the breadth of the mountain. The British ignored that warning. Modern climbers may unknowingly ignore it too. Because the final truth is this: the Himalayas are not empty. They never were. And as glaciers retreat and tunnels widen, the separation between surface humanity and the Pale Ones grows thinner. Not in myth, not in legend, in measurable data, in bone trauma, in DNA fragments, in thermal signatures that pulse beneath stone. The mountain is opening, and history has already shown what emerges when it does. The question is not whether they are real. The question is whether we are ready for contact. End of documentary. If you want the next story from the frozen unknown, subscribe. Because some legends are not stories.